Hi there. Incredibly, young as we are, we're at episode 26 of Idiot Wind, our blustering but rather marvellous guide to Dylan Vinyl, the definitive collection. And there comes a time when you have to apologise to your faithful viewers. And this is one of them, because today we're going to be discussing what I think is the worst album Bob Dylan ever made. And I've got no fear of contradiction in saying that. Strangely, the collection has missed out one album, and that album is also not very good, but it's not as bad as Down in the Groove. That album is the wonderfully packaged, Knocked Out Loaded. This came out in about 1986, I think, 1988, something like that. This was around the time when just after I'd first seen Bob with a terrible performance with Tom Petty at the Heartbreakers at Birmingham NEC in 1987, about which the less said the better. It put me off seeing him for at least a couple of years. This album, both this album and Down in the Groove remind me of Self-Portrait. Only in Self-Portrait, I think he was deliberately kind of trying to take the piss and kind of trying to put people off him. Here, I just think he hasn't got a clue. And this is full of misfits. There's a track on this written by Chris Christopherson. Bob Dylan sings Chris Christopherson. It should be the other way around, Bob. He should be singing your songs. But it's called They Killed Him. There was a man called Mahatma Gandhi. There was a man called Jesus Christ, Sid. Guess what? My God, they killed him. And that's not bad. There's a big synthesizer on it. Then a kid's choir comes in. That's one of the lowlights of Knocked Out Loaded. And another thing to bear in mind about this is when Bob was recording Empire Burlesque, which is the album we did in our last episode 25, he wrote a song called New Danville Girl. And this was around 11 minutes long. And everybody involved in the recording said, you know what? That's the best song we've done. So guess what? That didn't end up on the record. Obviously. Why ever would we think it would? But a re-recorded version called Brownsville Girl appears on this. And it's the only reason to get this record. If you have a chance to get a listen to Knocked Out Loaded, ignore the rest of it. Just listen to Brownsville Girl. New Danville Girl, the song on which it was based, was the lyric written by Bob with Sam Shepard, the actor and playwright. He's also credited on this, but Bob's rewritten it. And it's a marvellous lyric. It's a beautiful and funny and moving and intelligent look at masculinity. And one of Bob's favourite film stars, Gregory Peck, who he mentions several times during the song, as he says, I see just about everything he's in. But that's a great song, Brownsville Girl. Now we come to the subject of our episode: 180 gram of vinyl slab of Down in the Groove. I'm not saying it for several episodes. These pressings are great. Everything sounds great so far in the series, as good as it can, given the limitations of the original recordings. This doesn't sound great. It's not a matter of sound quality. It's because the content is shit. Like Self-Portrait, this is mainly an album of cover versions. There are 12 tracks. Sorry, there are 11 tracks. No, there are 10 tracks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 tracks on this. Only 4 of them have a Bob Dylan writing credit, and only 2 of them are solely credited to him. The rest of it is a bunch of average to shit to average again cover versions. So we start off with Bob doing all Brian Ferry and doing Let's Stick Together. What the fuck is going on? You know, the man who once owned an album with Tangled Up in Blue, like a Rolling Stone, is now doing a cover version of Let's Stick Together with Randy Jackson on bass from the Jackson 5. And we get all, again, it's a cast of thousands. Always a bad sign with Bob. When Did You Leave Heaven? God knows who wrote that. I'm not even going to look it up. That's just, again, a hugely synthesized soup of bollocks. That one is. Then we get Sally Sue Brown, which is a completely unremarkable rockabilly kind of rocker, which wastes the great Bobby King and Willie Green on backing vocals, and rather astonishingly includes Steve Jones of the Sex Pistols on guitar, and Paul Simon of the Clash on bass. Well, if you can remember that while you're listening to it, you're a better man than me. You must be Mr. Memory from the 39 Steps. Then we finally get track 4, a song Bob wrote. 4 tracks in. What's even more pathetic is this song is Death Is Not the End. The lineup on Death Is Not the End: Bob Dylan, Clyde King is one of his favourite backing singers, Mark Knopfler, Robbie Shakespeare, Sly Dunbar, Alan Clark. Oh, that's right. This was recorded 5 years earlier in the sessions for Infidels. This is an Infidels outtake. So we have to wait 4 songs to get a Bob Dylan song. And it's not a new song he's written. It's a song he rejected from Infidels 5 years earlier. Death Is Not the End is a bit of a dirge on this. It's got Full Force on background vocals. They're supposed to be hip, apparently, at the time. This has actually been presented quite dramatically in concert since then, years after this, by Nick Cave has done it, the Waterboys have done it, and they've had a great time with it. This is not a great version of Death Is Not the End. It's quite a nice song, goes on too long on here. In Springtime in New York, the box set I referred to in episode 25, I think, or 24. There's a very long version of it, which is not a barrel of laughs. Then we have another song by Bob with an all-star cast: Eric Clapton on guitar, Ron Wood on bass, and Mitchell Froome on keyboards, Henry Spinetti on drums, and that's called Had a Dream About You, Baby. Well, he's not written that for this album either. This is a rarity I'm going to show you now. This came out in 1986, I think. This is the soundtrack to a film called Hearts of Fire, in which Bob Dylan was one of the stars, with a woman called Fiona and Rupert Everett. These are the stars of this film. Bob Dylan and Rupert Everett, ladies and gentlemen. This album is utterly shit. The best track on it is Bob's cover of John Hyatt's The Usual. As for the rest of it, if ever you want to hear Rupert Everett sing Tainted Love, this is the album for you. But after you've heard this album, you'll never want to hear Rupert Everett sing Tainted Love again. Now, Had a Dream About You, Baby is the second to last song on this album. This is another version of a song off this. So again, we're not seeing many great signs of creativity or productivity from Bob. Side 2 opens with 2 co-compositions. These are both written with Robert Hunter, the lyricist for the Grateful Dead.
Yeah.
And one thing you've got to take into account was he wrote these lyrics for the Grateful Dead, and the Grateful Dead said, no thanks, we're not going to write any music for them. But he gave them to Bob, and Bob wrote number 1, Ugliest Girl in the World. I suppose it's a laugh. This is the bloke who wrote Desolation Row, Visions of Johanna, and fucking Chimes of Freedom, setting someone else's words to mediocre music. Silvio actually is all right. Silvio is okay. It looks like Bob's changed some of the words because it's got that incredibly over-the-top line at the end of every chorus. I'm going to go to the place that only dead men go. and I've seen him do Silvio, and Silvio's good live. Unfortunately, Ronnie Wood was on that version. I saw him do live. Anyway, again, we got Nathan East on bass on that, and Jerry Garcia and Bob Weir on backing vocals. Yeah, we won't record the song, Robert, but we'll do backing vocals on Bob's. Yeah. And then we go into 3 terrible cover versions. 90 Miles an Hour Down a Dead End Street. Who gives a fuck? Shenandoah, not bad, but he could do that in his sleep. And again, as in some of the songs of Empire Burlesque, sounds like he has. It ends with rank strangers to me. Bob accompanied just by the man who was around this time, Mr. Joni Mitchell, Larry Klein on bass. I've heard it loads of times, can't remember it at all. So anyway, that's it. And what did you think of it, Sid?
Well, I'd not heard the album before, as is customary to say. It's clearly some kind of contractual obligation album. I can see no other reason for putting it out. But I think it illustrates a problem with when artists get to a certain level, you know, like an artist like Bob Dylan. They become too big to fail, so that there's nobody around them who can say, what the fuck are you thinking about putting this shit out? Or in the writing stages or in the recording stages, there's nobody with sufficient either political or musical weight to be able to say, to hold the artist in check, or to at least sort of apply some kind of quality control. So I think when you're an artist of the undoubted stature that Bob Dylan is, you know, he can literally, you know, he could sing the Telephone Book and it would go out. And listening to this album, I often wish he would record the Telephone Book, because it would be preferable and it would be more interesting and enlightening than pretty much anything that's on here. I think that some of it made me laugh out loud. Which, I mean, as bad as Infidels was, none of it made me laugh. None of it made me snort with derision.
You've not heard They Killed Him off Knocked Out Loaded, though. That's a real laugh and a half.
But this album, there was one point. It was what was it called? Death Is Not the End. My God, I couldn't help but, you'd have to have, as the saying goes, you'd have to have a heart of stone not to laugh at Death Is Not the End. And of course, when it sort of says, you know, death is not the end, of course, my immediate thought is, no, death isn't the end. There's another fucking Bob Dylan album to have to listen to. If
let's hope it won't be the end, and there'll be loads of Dylan albums we can listen to after we're dead.
Well, that's the problem, you know.
As long as they're not down in the groove. You know,
and on this album, I mean, you know, death is not the end. Just staying with that as a metaphor, for example. I mean, this is, as you quite rightly pointed out, I mean, this is the death we're talking about is the death of any kind of shred of creativity from this period, from Bob. There's one track on it. I mean, again, it's that thing, as you rightly said yourself. You always know an artist's in trouble by the amount of guest musicians bust in to try and shore up you know, I mean, lots of artists have guest musicians come, and some artists that's how they work. But this isn't like that. This is just, you know, got Eric Clapton on it. It's got Martin. Well, so what? You know, what they're playing is so fucking mediocre in any event. I mean, you know, a kid down the local bar playing a bit of blues guitar could easily do what they're doing on this. There's no redeeming features in it. And I also thought, I actually listened to this twice.
You're joking.
There was not the whole.
I've never listened to it twice in quick succession.
Not the whole album. There was a track called "When Did You Leave Heaven," which isn't a Dylan original, and man, it has to be the most cack-handed, inept arrangement of the song. The song isn't a bad song. It's so badly done. Somebody came up with an arrangement Obviously, it's not Bob Dylan, but somebody involved in the production of this album thought it would be a good idea to instead of it being a 4/4 dirge, let's put in a slightly tricky time step, so that in a sense the rhythm sort of has to step over itself, and it's terrible because nobody is awake enough to make that change in the time sound like it's flying
integral,
or is in some way in some way making a point. So I mean, I can't think of any song on this album that is in any way redeeming at all. Usually on a Bob Dylan album, there's 9 times out of 10 there's one track that I don't mind, but this is poor stuff. At least it knows it's poor, and I think that's interesting. It knows it's poor. It knows it knows it's rubbish.
Yeah,
and it doesn't pretend to be anything other than a stopgap. When it's recorded, it's not like it's been invested with anything. I mean, almost. My guess is that Bob Dylan probably spent the least amount of time in the room when this was being recorded.
Well, the thing is, the sessions for this album are the most extended period of any Dylan album. It took months to make this album, but the reason it's taken months is, on and off, is because he hasn't got any stuff. He hasn't got any material. And in his book Chronicles, this is the time when he thought about giving up.
Yeah,
he doesn't want to make records. He's contractually obliged to.
That comes across.
And he says things like, well, if I make a record and spend all my life for 5 weeks making a record, no one's going to buy it anyway. And he's going into the studio with that defeatist attitude. He loathes the fact he can't write songs in this period. This is the point in Chronicles Volume 1 where he says he was thinking of giving it up and opening a wooden leg factory. And he actually did investigate opening a factory, giving up music completely. But that became such a complicated endeavor that by the time, and I think that's a kind of distraction for him, by the time he'd been touring with Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers. Apparently the early shows in America were very good. The one I saw, he was terrible. The Heartbreakers were great, but he was terrible at Birmingham in 1987, the night I saw him. And there's a degree of self-loathing about him in this period. What happens immediately after this album is, I think he realizes this is shit. I think he knows all along he's not cutting it in the studio. And so what happens then is he kind of abandons all thought of making any more records for a while. And he starts what's called the Never-Ending Tour. And what he does with these tours, he tours about 100 gigs a year, most years from then on. In the early years of the tour, which are the thing that people refer to, it went on for ages after that, but the actual core of the Never-Ending Tour, he began playing loads of obscure folk and blues songs he hadn't played for years from his own back catalogue. He changed sets every night. He went in the course of 100 gigs. He played literally several hundred songs. He'd come up with new arrangements for his own songs. He'd rewrite lyrics from years ago, and the distance between the dismal creativity on this record and the quite astonishing variety and creativity of his approach to gigs became very marked. But even after several months of that, he still felt like a bit wary of writing songs. And it was only in 88, 89, really, that he began to seriously sit down and write again. And the next time he goes in the studio, it'll be a new beginning for him. He goes into the studio with the producer Daniel Lenoir, and the difference between this and that is astonishing. But that won't be our next episode, unfortunately. Unfortunately, our next episode of this never-ending journey, look at your face light up, will be episode 27, and that will be a live album, Dylan and the Dead.
Oh.